Do you take photographs or videos? That's probably a rhetorical question because most people do. According to one survey, about 5 billion photos were taken every day last year, and the number's steadily increasing. So here's the real question. Are you planning to hang on to some or all of yours, whether for a year or the rest of your life? If you are, then this video is for you. Hi, I'm Gary, and I make videos on technical, but not too technical topics that interest me. Hopefully they'll interest or inform or perhaps entertain you also. I'll apologize again for starting with numbers, but I was simply staggered by the statistics. 1.7 trillion new photos were taken last year. That's at least a couple hundred for every person on Earth. Admittedly, 93% of those were taken with smartphones, but even the measly 7% taken with real cameras amounted to 350 million per day. Maybe some of you think of your photos as throwaways. I had an older friend we travel with who took thousands of pictures on every trip, and he never looked at them. He claimed it just made him focus better on what he was seeing. One survey showed that for teens and early 20-somethings, a third of their pictures are selfies. You probably don't need this video if all you photograph is yourself. But most photos are taken of people or places because someone wants a record of their experiences. Here's the thing. Memory is an imperfect phenomenon, and it gets worse as time goes on. You can probably look at the photos you took yesterday and recall everything about them. Unless you took hundreds of them, as I sometimes do on a trip. But I can pretty much guarantee that won't be true next year, or in 10 or 20 years. I'll give you a couple personal examples to show what I mean. My mother loved photos. She had thousands of prints, in drawers, boxes, and bins, almost all of people she knew or places she had been. But by the time I got interested in family history and started scanning her prints to convert them to digital, she was in her 80s. She could no longer recall who or what was in some of those photos, and only a fraction of the prints had anything written on the back as a clue. Here are a few examples of some that I'm sure are family photos that are simply lost in time. And I suspect that many, if not most people, are in the same boat. I have about 200,000 photos of my own, and they're pretty well organized by date. But the first 40,000 were color slides from the film era, which didn't offer a lot of options for labeling them. Okay, I've probably overworked trying to explain the problem to people who already know it exists. Let's look at what you can do about it if you care to. I should say up front that this video is not going to get into the details of how exactly to do it. There are a lot of options, and some of them can get pretty technical. If I see enough interest, I might do a more detailed video in the future. But you do need to know that a thing called metadata exists and generally what it's for. No relation to Meta, formerly Facebook. In the context of photographs, image metadata is information about a photo that's either embedded in an image file or stored in a separate file associated with it. There are a lot of types of metadata. Most are intended for some use that really doesn't matter for this video. For example, here is the metadata extracted from this single photograph. But all digital cameras, including phone cameras, record at least the date and time a photo was taken in the image file, as well as information about the exposure and what camera took it. If you have location data turned on, your phone may embed your actual location as well, but cameras generally don't have a GPS built in. Regardless, none of this is going to tell you that this photo is of your friend Laura getting married to Delbert in Livingston, Montana, or that this is the Majorelle Gardens in Marrakesh, or the names of these glaciers in the Swiss Alps. I had to look these things up because I'm way behind in captioning my old photos. So let us suppose you actually want to store some information that is useful to you in the metadata for a photo. How do you go about doing it? Understand we're only talking about digital photos here. If you do have older ones taken on film, you'll first have to convert them to digital, which you can do either by scanning them or by copying them with a digital camera or a phone. There's a bit of discussion about doing this in my earlier video on techno-hoarding, so I'll leave a link to that in the description. The short answer is that you need some software that will let you edit the metadata in your photos. But what metadata, you might ask? I'll show you an example of what I consider necessary, which you might consider at least as a starting point. This illustration will be from a particular piece of software that I use for this. It isn't free, and it does a lot more than edit metadata. In fact, I use it for organizing all my photos. But it's the easy way to show you which metadata items I find useful. If you look at the metadata panel over on the right, you can see that in addition to the automatically recorded time, date, and name that came from my camera, I have recorded a title, a description, and a few keywords for searching. Also the location data, city, state, country, the name of the place. And there is GPS data here, which also didn't come from the camera. I'll talk about that later. You wouldn't want to type all that in for every photo if you had a bunch of the same subject, same location, and so on. So most software for editing metadata lets you alter multiple files at once, typically all the photos in a folder, but sometimes all the results of a search. It can still be a lot of work if you take thousands of photos on a trip like I do, but the key to success is do it now, not later. When I'm on a trip, I try to get at least the basic info entered every night if possible, or at least have it written in my little notebook if I can't do that. And finishing up later can be sort of a relaxing spare time activity, if you don't get too far behind. In my case, I am unlikely to get it all done in my remaining lifetime, which is why I am emphasizing the importance of you trying to keep up with it. Let's talk about software for doing this. Most photo editing software is capable of showing and often editing metadata, but I would strongly recommend against doing it one photo at a time, unless you only take one photo of everything. Typically what you want is either some kind of image database program that lets you see and work on multiple pictures at once, or a program whose function is specifically editing metadata. If you're an Adobe Lightroom user, you may already know that it will edit metadata. I use Lightroom, but not for that, because it isn't my main organizing tool, which is the software you just saw a minute ago. It's called iMatch. I've been using it for years, it's regularly updated, and it will handle hundreds of thousands of image files. But if you don't want to spend money to do this, there are free metadata editor tools. I believe the most widely used one is called EXIF tool, developed by Phil Harvey. It's a command line tool, which means a lot of people will find it a bit hard to learn, but it is actually the underlying tool in a lot of other software, including iMatch, for example. A couple of people have written graphical front ends for it to make it easier for novices to use. The most current one I found is called JExif Tool GUI. It works on Windows, Linux, and Mac. There are probably iOS and Android tools for this also, but I admit I haven't looked. I can't imagine using a phone to edit a lot of photos at once. You may think otherwise. In general, I'd say you probably won't make a horrible mess of it if you stick to changing the things your phone or camera doesn't record anyway. You can always do it over. Changing the time or date internally in a photo is tricky because of inconsistencies in how devices handle time zones and daylight savings time. I'd avoid that problem by making sure your camera clock is set properly in the first place. I do want to touch on GPS data for those of you who use actual cameras or who don't like to keep location data turned on in your phone so that Google can't track you. Why do you want GPS data? Well, in many cases, it's the only clear way to define a photo location, and you can use it to figure out where you actually were. There are even reverse geocoding programs that will try to identify a photo location by name from the GPS coordinates, although the ones I've tried haven't worked perfectly for me. In any event, nobody wants to type in GPS data even if you have it. So one way to do this is to use some software that has a map mode, where you can find the spot on the map, and the program then enters the coordinates for you. Lightroom will do this, as will iMatch, and there's a free program called GeoSetter that's designed for exactly this purpose. Most of these programs previously used Google Maps, but Google changed their system some years back so that doing this on a very large scale costs money. As a result, some software changed to using OpenStreetMaps or something similar, which is generally not as detailed as Google Maps, but it'll still work okay if you're okay at reading maps. However, it's a lot easier if you get the GPS data in the image files automatically somehow. If you take pictures with a phone, just turn your location data on and make sure your GPS is working. The phone will do the work for you. If you use a camera, many newer cameras will link to the GPS in your phone using the camera maker's app through low-energy Bluetooth, and then they'll embed the GPS data as you take the photos. But I personally find it a bit tricky to get all this working together in real time, not to mention having to keep my phone on all the time. So instead I use a separate GPS device, usually my watch, to record a track of my position. Then later I combine the time-based GPS track with the times in my photos to put GPS coordinates in the photos. iMatch will do this in an automated fashion, as long as the watch and the camera have their times synchronized. I know this is a once-over lightly treatment of this subject. Making a tutorial on how exactly to do it would make a much longer video. My aim here was primarily to argue that people who care about their photos might want to address this whole issue, and to provide enough information to persuade you that it's doable. As usual, I have no intention of telling you that mine is the absolute best way to do it. But it works for me, and some version of it could work for you. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching.